Before we talk about the six-figure severance agreement my former employer signed last November, I need to explain why my own mother spent 8 months telling her church group that I had stolen money from my family and run away in shame. I was standing in the parking lot of a FedEx office in Boise, Idaho, holding a certified mail receipt when my cousin Lee sent me a screenshot. It was a text thread between her and my aunt. The message from my aunt read, "Pray for our family. Joanna has always been troubled. We are still trying to understand what she took and why she ran." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, standing next to a stranger loading boxes into a minivan. My name is Jonah Marsh. I'm 31 years old. I have never stolen anything in my life. What I had done 6 weeks before that parking lot moment was refuse to co-sign a business loan for my older brother. That was it. That was the crime. My brother Russ had been trying to open a second location of his auto detailing shop in Meridian for 2 years. The first location, the one in Garden City, was barely keeping its head above water. He had borrowed against it twice already and burned through a small business grant from the state in less than a year. The accountant my mother hired to review his books told her plainly that expanding before stabilizing the first location was a mistake. She fired the accountant. When Rose came to me, he needed a co-signer because his personal credit score was a number I had never seen an adult achieve. He sat across from me at my kitchen table with a manila folder, and that particular expression men in my family wear when they want something. Not asking exactly, more like announcing a plan they expect you to participate in. I looked at the loan documents. The requested amount was $140,000. The monthly payment would have been more than my rent. If Russ defaulted, the liability fell entirely to me because the bank had assessed his collateral as insufficient. I was not a backup. I was the loaned. I said no. The silence at my kitchen table lasted about 4 seconds. Then Russ picked up his folder and left without saying goodbye. Within 48 hours, my mother had a news story. She told it to my aunt, to 3 women from her Sunday school class, and to a neighbor she barely knew. The story was that I had found a way to drain a small joint account my grandmother had set up years ago for both Russ and me, and that I had fled rather than face what I had done. The account had about $4,000 in it. I had not touched it in over a year. Russ had a debit card for it too, and had used it regularly, but that part did not appear in my mother's story. I did not call my mother to yell. I had learned a long time ago that confronting her directly was like throwing a lit match into a room she had already filled with gasoline. She did not argue, she performed. She would cry. She would speak in that low, trembling voice about how much she had sacrificed. And by the end of the conversation, I would somehow be apologizing for my own outrage. I packed a bag, put my cat in a carrier, and drove to Boise, where my college friend let me sleep in her spare room while I figured out my next move. I need to back up a little, because the thing that saved me did not come from nothing. It came from a woman most people in my family considered eccentric. My grandmother on my mother's side was named Cecily. She had been a bookkeeper for a regional trucking company for 35 years, and she had the kind of relationship with the spreadsheet that other people have with religion. She did not trust banks entirely, but she understood them completely. She kept a handwritten ledger going back to 1978. When I was 12, she started letting me sit with her while she balanced her accounts. Most 12-year-olds would have been bored out of their minds. I was not. Grandma Cecily used to say that money is just a record of decisions. A good decision leaves a trail you are proud of. A bad one leaves a trail you spend the rest of your life trying to bury. She said this while writing in her ledger with a mechanical pencil, and she always pressed hard enough that you could feel the impression of the numbers on the page below. When I was in college, she called me on a Sunday afternoon and walked me through the concept of a limited liability company. She explained the difference between a sole proprietorship and an LLC in the way she explained everything, which was simply and without condescension. She told me that if I ever started anything, whether it was a business or a freelance project or anything I might build on my own, I should build it inside a legal structure that had its own identity. She said, "Your name is not a shield, a properly filed entity is." I was a junior studying graphic design at the time. I was not thinking about corporate structure. But I filed the conversation away. I graduated, got a job at a mid-sized marketing firm in Boise, and spent 5 years building skills in a client list that technically belonged to my employer. I was good at what I did. I could look at a brand identity problem and see its solution in about the time it took most people to open a new browser tab. My clients renewed. My accounts grew. I asked for a raise twice and was told the budget was tight both times, while watching two male colleagues at my level get promoted in the same quarter. I had already started thinking about leaving before Russ came to my kitchen table with his folder. After I said no. After my mother built her story. After I drove to Boise with my cat and my laptop, I had two choices. I could spend my energy defending myself against a lie, or I could spend it building something that would make the lie irrelevant. I chose the second one. I remembered what Grandma Cecily told me. I opened my laptop at my friend's kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night and spent 4 hours researching Idaho business entity formation. I filed an LLC with the Idaho Secretary of State. I named it Clearwater Brand Studio. Clearwater is a river in northern Idaho. It runs through country that is difficult to develop and nearly impossible to fence off. Grandma Cecily would have appreciated the metaphor. The filing cost $90. Then I did the thing that my situation at the marketing firm had already been pushing me toward. I contacted 6 clients I had managed personally. I did not poach them in any way that violated my employment agreement. I told them I was going independent and asked if they would be willing to consider working with me directly once my non-compete window had passed. 4 of them said yes without hesitation. One of them asked if I could start immediately. I put in my 2 weeks' notice. My employer did not take it well. My manager called the departing conversation professional, but the email that came from HR 3 days later was less so. It cited a clause in my original contract about client relationships and suggested that my independent business represented a violation of the non-compete agreement. I forwarded the email to an employment attorney I had already contacted the week before. The thing about non-compete clauses in Idaho is that they are enforceable manually. The courts have consistently held that a clause must be reasonable in scope, geography, and duration. My contract's clause was written broadly enough to be challenged, and my attorney told me so in the first 15 minutes of our consultation. But I was also in the middle of trying to keep my mother's story from quietly destroying my professional reputation because my former employer and my mother moved in some overlapping social circles, in the way that things overlap in a mid-sized city where everyone's kids went to the same schools. The person who kept me grounded during all of this was my cousin Lee. She was not close to my mother or my brother. She was the one who sent me the screenshot that day in the parking lot. Not to warn me, but to warn me. She was a family member who had watched the dynamic my whole life and had her own complicated feelings about it. Lee worked as a paralegal in Boise. She was methodical, quiet, and she had a memory like a filing cabinet. When I told her what was happening, she did not say "I'm so sorry" or "that's terrible." She asked me 2 questions. She asked what evidence existed of the joint account balance and transaction history, and she asked whether my mother had said these things in writing anywhere. Both answers turned out to be yes. Lee had kept a screenshot. My aunt had forwarded my mother's original text to several family members, one of whom had replied to the whole chain, which meant there was a digital trail of exactly who had received the false information and when. Meanwhile, the joint account had a complete transaction history accessible through the bank's online portal. Russ's withdrawals were time-stamped and visible. My absence from the withdrawal history was equally clear. Lee started organizing everything into a folder, not because we had decided to do anything with it yet, just because she understood that evidence has a shelf life and you preserve it before you need it, not after. I focused on Clearwater. I worked from my friend's spare room for the first 2 months. My cat sat on the windowsill. I drank too much coffee. I billed more hours in those 2 months than I had billed in any quarter at my previous job. The clients I had brought over were happy. They referred me to others. I've hired a contractor to handle overflow design work. I opened a separate business checking account to the LLC and kept my personal finances completely separate, which was something Grandma Cecily had been very specific about. The non-compete dispute settled out of court 4 months after my resignation. My attorney negotiated a release that also included a non-disparagement clause running in both directions. My former employer could not discuss my departure in negative terms. I could not discuss the specifics of the settlement. What I can say is that the amount covered my legal fees and several months of operating expenses for Clearwater. My mother's story, meanwhile, had started to develop cracks. Part of it was the bank records, which Lee had quietly shared with my aunt after my aunt made a comment at a family dinner that Lee attended. My aunt is not a vindictive person. She is the kind of woman who responds to new information by actually updating her position, which is rarer in families than it should be. When she saw the account history, she went quiet for a long moment and then asked Lee for the originals so she could keep them. Part of it was that Rose's finances had continued to deteriorate visibly. The first shop in Garden City had closed by month 7. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a community when the thing someone was supposed to need a rescue for collapses anyway. It made people do the math. And part of it was something I had not anticipated. Grandma Cecily died in the spring. She had been declining for about a year, and her passing was not a shock, but grief does not care about preparation. I flew back for the service. I had not been back since the parking lot. I sat in the third row at the church and did not speak to my mother or Russ, and afterward, at the small reception at my aunt's house, I stood near the kitchen and talked to cousins I had not seen in years. One of them, a woman named Petra, who I had barely known growing up, pulled me aside near the back door. Petra was in her late 30s and worked in accounting in Portland. She had heard the version of events my mother had been circulating. She had also apparently done her own research because she told me she had looked up the Idaho Secretary of State Business Registry and found Clearwater Brand Studio. She said she was glad I had built something. She said it in the way Grandma Cecily used to say things, which was simply and without condescension. I did not cry at the church. I cried in my rental car in the parking lot of my aunt's street, just for a minute, and then I drove to the airport. What I did not know in that parking lot was that Grandma Cecily had updated her will 8 months before she died. Her estate was modest. She had a small house, a savings account, some furniture, and a collection of mechanical pencils she kept in a coffee can on her desk. She also had a clause in the revised will that I only found out about 3 weeks later, when the estate attorney contacted me. Grandma Cecily had left me her savings account and, more importantly, a letter she had written herself and had notarized as a formal addendum to the estate documents. The letter was 4 pages long. It was written in her handwriting, pressed firmly into the page. She wrote about the joint account. She wrote that she had set it up knowing full well what my mother and Russ were likely to do with it eventually, and that she had kept her own records of the balance and the intended use. She wrote that I had never once taken anything that was not allocated to me. She wrote that she had watched my mother use narrative the way other people use tools, not to illuminate, but to control. She wrote that she was sorry she had not said more of this out loud while she was alive. She also wrote something I have thought about every day since. She wrote, I have watched this family for 81 years, and the only person I ever saw build a wall and then fill it with something real was you. Do not let them reach over it. The letter was a notarized legal document, which meant it was admissible, which meant my attorney could use it. By the time I understood the full implications, my mother had made one more miscalculation. She had contacted the HR department of a regional nonprofit where I had applied for a contract position. She presented herself as a concerned family member with information relevant to my professional character. She gave them the version of the story about the joint account. She did this in writing via email, because my mother had always believed that putting things in writing made them more official, without understanding that it also made them evidence. The nonprofit forwarded her email to me as part of their standard due diligence process. I read it on a Tuesday afternoon sitting at my desk in the Clearwater studio, which by then was a rear office, a small one, in a shared building near downtown Boise. I had told full-time contractors and a client list that generated enough revenue to pay all of us. I forwarded the email to my attorney that same afternoon. He added it to a growing file. Defamation in Idaho requires proof that someone made a false statement of fact, that they communicated it to a third party, that it caused damage, and that they acted with at least negligent disregard for the truth. My mother's email to the nonprofit hit every element. It was false. It was sent to a third party. It had caused direct professional damage, and she had the banned records available to her if she had chosen to look. She had not chosen to look. What followed was not dramatic. There was no courtroom confrontation. There was no moment where my mother broke down and confessed in front of the family. Real accountability is usually quieter than that. My attorney sent a formal demand letter to my mother. It detailed the defamation claim, the transmittal to the nonprofit, and the damages. It referenced Grandma Cecily's notarized letter as a component of the evidentiary record. It gave her 30 days to respond. She responded to a family friend who was not an attorney and who had no standing to respond on her behalf legally, but who called my aunt to say that my mother was very hurt and that this was not how family handled things. My attorney sent a follow-up letter explaining that this was, in fact, exactly how people handle things when a family member sent false statements to a professional organization in writing. My mother retained a local attorney. His initial response letter characterized my grandmother's notarized addendum as the confused wishes of a declining elderly woman. I found that characterization difficult to read. I also found it legally ineffective, which my attorney confirmed. The case settled before it ever reached a filing. The terms included a written retraction sent to the non-profit, a letter to the extended family acknowledging that the statements about the joint account were inaccurate, and a non-disparagement agreement that prohibited future false statements about my professional conduct. My mother signed it. I do not know how she felt about signing it. I know how I felt. I felt the particular exhaustion of a long project finally reaching its last deliverable. Not triumphant, not vindicated exactly, just finished. Leigh came to my office the afternoon after I received the signed documents. She brought coffee from the place down the block and sat across from me at the small table near the window. We did not celebrate in any obvious way. She read through the retraction letter once and set it down and said, "Grandma would have kept a copy of that in her ledger." I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. The retraction letter went to the extended family in the form of a brief email from my mother's attorney. My aunt called me the same evening it arrived. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she wished she had asked more questions earlier. I told her that was all right. I meant it. Russ did not call. I did not expect him to. The non-profit offered me the contract. I declined, not because of any lingering bitterness, but because by then Clearwater had enough work that I did not need it. The reason I had applied in the first place was to keep options open during the period when my mother's story was still circulating. By the time the settlement was signed, the story had no air left in it. My mother moved to a smaller house on the other side of the city. She attends a different church now. I know this only because Leigh mentioned it once, and I did not ask for details. I'm sitting at my desk in the Clearwater studio right now. The window looks out over a parking lot, which is not scenic, but the light in the afternoon comes in at an angle that is useful for reviewing design work. There is a mechanical pencil on my desk that I took from my grandmother's coffee can after the estate was settled. I do not write with it often. I keep it where I can see it. Here is what I know from everything I have been through. The people who try to take things from you are usually most dangerous not when they act openly, but when they dress the act in language about family and obligation and love. They count on the fact that you will hesitate before you name what they are actually doing, because naming it feels ungenerous. It feels like an overreaction. It feels like you are betraying the story everyone has agreed to tell. You are not betraying anything. You are reading the ledger correctly. Grandma Cecily used to say that a good decision leaves a trail you are proud of. The trail I built over the past 2 years is not perfect. There are months in there that were genuinely frightening. There were nights I questioned whether I had handled everything the right way, whether I had been too rigid, whether some version of this could have been solved over a phone call. But I have never, not for a single day, regretted building a wall and filling it with something real. If your family is telling a story about you right now, a story you did not write and cannot recognize yourself in, I want you to know something. The story is not the truth. The story is a tool, and tools can be taken out of the wrong hands. You do not have to confront anyone to do that. You do not have to win a living room. You just have to build something they cannot reach. Something with your name on it. Something with roots deep enough that no one can hire a landscaper to remove it. Start there. The rest has a way of following. There is a mechanical pencil on my desk right now that belonged to my grandmother. She pressed hard when she wrote. You could always feel the numbers on the page below the one she was working on. I blocked that a lot. The idea that the decisions you make leave an impression on everything underneath them, whether you intend it or not. My mime but in my Lizzie Jones 4 years that she believed left no trace. A story told to a church group here, a text forwarded to an aunt there. She operated on the assumption that words spoken in a community stay inside that community. What she did not understand is that information moves the same way water does. It finds every crack. It goes where gravity takes it. And if you have been building on ground that is not level, eventually the water shows you exactly where the foundation is wrong. Russ made the same kind of miscalculation. He built a business the way some people approach relationships, on the assumption that someone else would absorb the cost of his mistakes. When I refused to be that person, he did not ask himself what he needed to change. He let my mother rewrite the story instead. That is what happens when someone has spent a lifetime being rescued from consequences. They do not develop the capacity to look at a problem and say, I caused this. They develop the capacity to find someone else to name as the cause. It protected him for a while. It always does, until it doesn't. What I keep coming back to is Grandma Cecily at her kitchen table with that ledger. She was not a dramatic person. She did not give speeches. She just showed me over and over that clarity is a form of protection. Knowing exactly what you have, where it came from, and what you owe, that is not just accounting. That is a way of living that makes it very hard for anyone to rewrite your history because you have written it yourself in ink that does not smear. That is the thing I want to say most directly to anyone sitting with a version of what I went through. The people who tried to take something from me were not uniquely evil. They were people who had never been asked to be honest about what they were doing. My mother genuinely believed her version of events because she had told it often enough. My brother genuinely believed he was owed something because no one had ever clearly said otherwise. The damage they caused was real. But it was also, in a precise and almost mechanical way, the result of choices made over years without anyone holding a ledger up to the light. What changed my situation was not luck. It was that I had been taught to keep records. I had been taught to build structures that had their own legal identity. I had been taught that understanding how something works, a contract, a filing, a clause in a settlement, is not a specialty skill. It is basic self-respect made practical. And when things got hard, when I was sleeping in a friend's spare room with my cat on the windowsill, and my mother's story spreading through family inboxes, I did not fight the story. I built something so visible and so documented that the story had nowhere left to stand. That is all I did. I kept the receipts. I filed the paperwork. I found people, Lee, my attorney, eventually Petra and my aunt, who were willing to look at evidence and update their position accordingly. And I did not stop working. There is a version of this story where I spent those 8 months trying to convince people, calling relatives, defending myself, asking my mother to tell the truth. I have thought about that version. I think it ends with me exhausted and unchanged, and my mother with a new chapter about how difficult I had become. The version I lived ends with a signed retraction in every family inbox and a company with my name on it. Grandma Cecily knew which version she was preparing me for. She just never said it out loud. She pressed it into the page and trusted me to feel it.